Hey guys, tonight we begin with the absolutely ridiculous saga of Liu Wei, a poet so spectacularly bad at his job that he managed to single-handedly destroy the entire literary reputation of the Tang Dynasty's capital city. One man wrote a poem so offensive that it literally caused a diplomatic incident with 3 neighboring kingdoms and got him banned from every tea house within a 100-mile radius. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey through the most wonderfully disastrous literary career in Chinese history together. Let's start with the biggest misconception about ancient Chinese poets. Everyone thinks these guys were wise, contemplative masters floating around in silk robes, composing profound verses about bamboo and moonlight while sipping tea from delicate porcelain cups. In reality, most poets were basically the equivalent of today's struggling artists living off ramen noodles and questionable life choices. Except instead of ramen, they survived on rice wine and the occasional charity dumpling. This wasn't some romantic, ethereal existence where enlightened scholars debated the deeper meaning of cherry blossoms. It was more like a bunch of perpetually drunk guys trying to one-up each other with increasingly ridiculous poems about how their girlfriend left them for a merchant or how the emperor's new tax policy was ruining their buzz. Think less wise sage contemplating nature and more guy at open mic night who's had too many drinks and thinks he's the next great voice of his generation. The year 847 CE was peak Tang Dynasty chaos. Chang'an, the capital, wasn't some serene cultural paradise where scholars peacefully discussed philosophy over jasmine tea. It was a sprawling, overcrowded metropolis of over 1 million people where poets competed for attention, like modern influencers fighting for likes. The Imperial Poetry Bureau controlled who got the good gigs reading at court, and if you weren't in their good graces, you were stuck performing at sketchy taverns where the audience was more interested in their gambling than your carefully crafted metaphors about seasonal transitions. If you thought ancient China was all Zen gardens and quiet contemplation, think again. This was literary Hunger Games with silk robes and way more alcohol. The poetry scene was cutthroat. Established poets formed exclusive cliques. Newcomers got hazed worse than college freshmen. And everyone was constantly stealing each other's best lines and claiming them as original work. Social media drama has nothing on what happened when someone accused you of plagiarizing their poem about autumn leaves. The imperial court had official poetry competitions where careers were made or destroyed based on whether your verse about the emperor's magnificent beard properly captured his divine essence or accidentally implied he looked like a moldy peach. Career suicide was just one poorly chosen metaphor away, and the literary equivalent of cancel culture could end your livelihood faster than you could say inappropriate haiku about the empress. Enter Liu Wei, a 32-year-old aspiring poet from a small village who arrived in Chang'an with exactly 3 copper coins, a bag of moldy rice, and the unshakable confidence that his poems about his pet chicken were going to revolutionize Chinese literature forever. His background was about as humble as it gets, son of a turnip farmer who thought poetry was what you did when you were too lazy for real work. But Liu Wei had dreams, terrible judgment, and absolutely zero understanding of how the imperial poetry world actually functioned. He genuinely believed that raw talent and authentic rural experiences would immediately catapult him to fame and fortune. His first week in the capital, he showed up at the prestigious Golden Pavilion Poetry Society's monthly reading wearing his best and only robe, which was made from repurposed grain sacks and still smelled faintly of fertilizer. He confidently announced that he was going to perform his masterpiece, a 47-stanza epic poem titled Ode to My Beloved Hen, precious dumpling, who lays eggs of pure poetry. The sophisticated urban poet stared in horror as he launched into detailed descriptions of his chicken's daily activities, including what she ate for breakfast and her bathroom habits. The performance ended with Liu Wei making chicken noises to capture the authentic rural experience while the audience sat in stunned silence. And if you think that's embarrassingly awkward, wait until you hear about what happened when he tried to impress the Imperial Poetry Bureau with his follow-up piece about romantic turnip farming. This wasn't just about one delusional guy embarrassing himself at poetry readings. Liu Wei's spectacular failures would eventually expose the entire hypocrisy and pretentiousness of the Tang Dynasty's literary establishment, accidentally revealing how disconnected the elite cultural scene had become from actual human experience. His genuine, if misguided, attempts to bring authentic rural life into highbrow poetry would inadvertently challenge centuries of tradition about what subjects were considered worthy of artistic expression. The consequences rippled through every level of society, from the farmers who suddenly felt represented in literature for the first time, to the court poets who panicked that their carefully maintained monopoly on cultural relevance was being threatened by some guy who wrote love songs to livestock. This would become a story about class warfare fought through terrible poetry, cultural gatekeeping challenged by someone too clueless to understand the gates existed, and how sometimes the most profound social changes come from people who have absolutely no idea what they're doing. The stakes were higher than anyone realized. This was about who gets to decide what counts as art, and whether authentic expression matters more than technical skill and social connections. But Liu Wei's disastrous debut at the Golden Pavilion was just the beginning of his journey from unknown village nobody to the most infamous poet in imperial history. His next brilliant idea involved the emperor's birthday celebration, a very important diplomatic banquet, and a poem that would literally cause an international incident. The first major theme we need to understand is the absolutely ridiculous class warfare that existed in Tang Dynasty poetry circles. Think high school cafeteria politics, but with more silk and significantly higher stakes. Unlike what most people assume about ancient Chinese culture being all harmonious and respectful, the poetry world was basically mean girls with literary pretensions and government backing. The Imperial Poetry Bureau didn't just control who got a read at fancy events. They literally determined your social status, marriage prospects, and whether you'd eat anything better than street noodles for the rest of your life. This literary caste system had developed over centuries into something so rigid and absurd that it would make modern academia look welcoming and inclusive. At the top were the inherited poets, guys whose great-grandfathers had written one decent poem about the emperor's horse, and who'd been coasting on family reputation ever since. Below them were the scholar poets who'd passed the imperial examinations, but couldn't write anything more creative than grocery lists. Then came the court-approved poets, who specialized in poems so boring they could cure insomnia, but they knew exactly which officials to flatter and which topics were guaranteed to get nods of approval. At the very bottom were the street poets. Basically, anyone who wasn't born into the right family or hadn't figured out how to game the system. These were often the most talented writers, but they might as well have been invisible to the establishment. The gap between the elite poetry world and everyone else wasn't just about money or education. It was about knowing an incredibly complex set of unwritten rules about which metaphors were acceptable, which classical references proved you were cultured, and most importantly, which subjects were too lowbrow to ever mention in polite literary company. Liu Wei was about to crash into this system like a turnip-scented wrecking ball, and the collision would be spectacular to witness. Take the infamous monthly poetry competition at the Jade Dragon Tea House. the most prestigious literary event in Chang'an, where careers were made and destroyed faster than you could brew a proper cup of tea. Picture this: the city's most important poets, dressed in their finest robes, sitting in carefully arranged social hierarchies while servants burned expensive incense and served delicate pastries that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The established poets would present refined verses about classical themes, the loneliness of autumn, the wisdom of ancient sages, or tasteful metaphors comparing the emperor to various celestial bodies. Then Liu Wei showed up with his latest masterpiece, a poem called The Ballad of Constipated Chan, about his landlord's digestive troubles and how they related to the natural cycles of the universe. He genuinely thought he was being profound by connecting human bodily functions to cosmic harmony. But what the audience heard was a detailed description of an old man's bathroom schedule set to traditional poetry rhythms. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear silk rustling as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Liu Wei wasn't finished. He followed up with Spring Festival Blues, which started as a traditional seasonal poem, but quickly devolved into complaints about how expensive everything was in the capital, how his roommates snored, and how he missed his mother's turnip soup. The piece climaxed with him actually producing a turnip from his sleeve and taking a bite of it on stage, while reciting verses about agricultural authenticity. The head judge, Master Wang, a 70-year-old poet whose family had been writing formally approved verses for 6 generations, literally fainted and had to be carried out by servants. Another legendary incident involved the Spring Poetry Festival, where Liu Wei somehow convinced the organizers to let him perform what he called interactive agricultural poetry. He had convinced 3 actual farmers to attend as his backup chorus and had them bring farm tools as authentic props. The performance began normally enough with a poem about planting seasons, but quickly became a full agricultural demonstration. As Liu Wei and his farmer friends started hoeing imaginary soil while chanting verses about crop rotation techniques, the crowd of refined urban poets watched in horror as Liu Wei's artistic collaborators began explaining proper manure application techniques between poetry stanzas. The evening reached its peak when one of the farmers, getting carried away with the performance, started a detailed lecture about pig breeding that somehow got incorporated into a poem about the emperor's wisdom. The event ended with dirt being tracked across expensive carpets, several society ladies requiring smelling salts, and Liu Wei being permanently banned from any venue that served food. The most devastating example was his attempted collaboration with Master Li, one of the most respected poets in the empire. Liu Wei had somehow convinced himself that Li was impressed by his authentic rural perspective and proposed they write a joint piece for the emperor's birthday celebration. What he didn't realize was that Li was planning to use Liu Wei as comic relief, the literary equivalent of bringing a dancing monkey to entertain guests. Li's plan was to present his own refined birthday ode, then have Liu Wei perform something appropriately rustic as a charming contrast to demonstrate the empire's diversity. Instead, Liu Wei surprised everyone by presenting what he called the disastrous, the empire's diversity. Instead, Liu Wei surprised everyone by presenting what he called the people's birthday song for His Imperial Majesty, a poem written entirely in agricultural dialect that compared the emperor to various farm animals in ways that were intended as compliments but sounded like elaborate insults. He rhymed, "Your Majesty's glorious reign with my pig's impressive brain," and somehow worked in references to fertilizer spreading techniques as metaphors for imperial wisdom spreading across the land. Master Li's reputation never fully recovered from being associated with what court historians would later record as the pig incident of 847. But it wasn't that simple, because Liu Wei's disasters were accidentally exposing some uncomfortable truths about the poetry establishment that nobody wanted to acknowledge. While the refined poets mocked his crude subject matter and terrible technique, ordinary people started showing up to his performances, specifically because they could actually understand what he was talking about. His poems about everyday struggles, paying rent, dealing with difficult neighbors, missing home cooking, resonated with audiences who'd been completely excluded from traditional poetry culture. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. The officially sanctioned poets were creating beautiful, technically perfect works that had absolutely nothing to do with how actual people lived their lives. They wrote elaborate metaphors about seasonal changes that only made sense if you'd never actually worked outside, and their poems about rural life were so romanticized they bore no resemblance to actual farming. Meanwhile, Liu Wei's terrible poetry was accidentally more authentic and relatable than anything the establishment had produced in decades. Even more complicating was the fact that some of the younger, more educated poets were privately admitting that Liu Wei's approach, while technically awful, had a kind of honest energy that their own work lacked. They'd been so trained to follow classical forms and approve themes that they'd forgotten how to express genuine human experiences. A few brave souls started experimenting with incorporating more realistic subject matter into their own work, though they were careful to do it with much more sophisticated language and traditional poetic structures. The most uncomfortable contradiction was that Liu Wei's complete ignorance of literary rules was sometimes producing accidentally brilliant moments. His poem about missing his village during a thunderstorm, while full of technical errors and inappropriate language, captured something about homesickness and displacement that resonated even with sophisticated readers. His description of trying to make friends in the big city, told through the metaphor of his chicken learning to live with urban pigeons, was genuinely moving despite being completely ridiculous. This created a crisis for the poetry establishment. How do you maintain cultural standards while acknowledging that sometimes the untrained amateur captures truths that the experts have missed? How do you preserve artistic tradition when tradition has become so rigid it's lost touch with human experience? And most uncomfortably, what does it say about your entire literary culture when the most authentic voice belongs to someone who doesn't even know the basic rules of poetry composition? The result was literary chaos unlike anything the Tang Dynasty had ever experienced. The Poetry Bureau found themselves in the impossible position of having to either acknowledge that their entire system might be flawed or double down on excluding authentic voices in favor of maintaining traditional standards. They chose the latter, which only made Liu Wei more popular with ordinary people who were starting to see him as a champion of common folk against literary elitism, whose affected became a complex web of social disruption. Established poets found their audiences questioning why traditional poetry was so disconnected from real life. Young poets caught between old rules and new possibilities started experimenting with more accessible language, causing their mentors to worry about declining standards. Tavern owners discovered that advertising authentic peasant poetry could pack their venues with curious audiences, leading to a boom in underground literary events that the Poetry Bureau couldn't control. The institutional reaction was predictably panicked and counterproductive. The Poetry Bureau issued official guidelines about appropriate subject matter and maintaining cultural dignity that were so restrictive. They basically banned any reference to normal human activities. They started requiring poets to submit their work for approval before public performances, which only drove the more interesting writers underground. They even tried to create an official rural poetry category, thinking they could contain the authenticity movement by giving it a designated space. But their approved rural poems were so sanitized and fake that they made Liu Wei's genuine awkwardness looked sophisticated by comparison. How people responded revealed deep class divisions that have been hidden beneath the surface of cultural unity. Working class audiences embraced Liu Wei as someone who finally spoke their language, while educated elites were horrified that poetry, their exclusive cultural domain, was being democratized by someone who didn't understand its proper boundaries. Middle-class merchants and minor officials found themselves caught between these worlds, attracted to Liu Wei's authenticity, but worried about being associated with such obviously low-class entertainment. The long-term implications were starting to become clear. This wasn't just about one bad poet causing trouble, but about fundamental questions of who gets to participate in culture and what makes art valuable. Liu Wei's accidental challenge to literary authority was forcing everyone to confront whether technical skill and social approval mattered more than genuine expression and popular appeal. The Poetry Bureau's attempts to shut down this conversation only made it more urgent and visible, setting up a conflict that would reshape Chinese literary culture in ways nobody could have predicted. Meanwhile, news of Chang'an's poetry controversy was spreading beyond the capital, reaching the ears of officials in neighboring kingdoms who were starting to wonder what kind of cultural chaos was brewing in the Tang Dynasty. Regional governors were receiving reports about this mysterious peasant poet who was somehow undermining imperial literary authority, and they weren't sure whether this represented a dangerous political movement or just harmless entertainment gone wrong. The Poetry Bureau realized they had a public relations disaster on their hands that was growing bigger every day. Liu Wei's reputation was spreading faster than they could control, and his influence was starting to inspire copycat poets in other cities who thought they could achieve fame by imitating his authentic rural style, usually with even more disastrous results than the original. But the real crisis was still to come. Liu Wei, completely oblivious to the political firestorm he'd created, was about to make his biggest mistake yet, attempting to participate in the emperor's official birthday celebration with a poem that would turn a local literary controversy into an international diplomatic incident. His next performance would prove that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is someone who has absolutely no idea how much trouble they're causing. If the first theme was about class warfare within Chang'an's poetry scene, then the second major theme was about cultural contagion, how Liu Wei's spectacularly bad poetry started spreading like a literary virus across the entire Tang Dynasty, mutating and evolving in ways that made the original look almost sophisticated by comparison. The context for this new development was that news traveled surprisingly fast in ancient China, especially when that news involved someone making a complete fool of themselves in entertainingly public ways. What made this phenomenon particularly fascinating was that Liu Wei's influence wasn't spreading because people thought he was good. It was spreading because his failures were so memorable and relatable that they gave other aspiring poets permission to be equally terrible. This became important because it accidentally democratized poetry in the most chaotic way possible, breaking down centuries of gatekeeping, not through revolutionary ideology or cultural reform, but through sheer incompetence so spectacular that it inspired imitators. The rural poetry movement, as historians would later call it, wasn't really a movement at all. It was more like a collective breakdown of literary standards that happened when people realized they didn't need to be good at poetry to get attention for poetry. Liu Wei had accidentally proven that authenticity, even when delivered through objectively awful verse, could be more compelling than technical perfection delivered without any genuine human connection. This created a new category of cultural participation that hadn't existed before: performative authenticity. People started deliberately writing bad poetry about mundane subjects, thinking they were capturing Liu Wei's authentic rural spirit. But most of them were urban residents who'd never lived on a farm and were just as disconnected from real rural life as the traditional poets they were mocking. The result was a kind of fake authenticity that was somehow even more artificial than the original elite poetry it was rebelling against. What nobody anticipated was how this would spiral completely out of control once it reached the provinces, where local officials and regional poets tried to adapt Liu Wei's approach to their own circumstances, usually with catastrophic results that made his chicken poems look like masterpieces of restraint and good judgment. The Tang Dynasty was about to experience the literary equivalent of a pandemic, spread not by microorganisms, but by the infectious belief that anyone could write poetry as long as they were willing to embarrass themselves thoroughly enough in public. Consider the case of Jiang Min, a tea merchant from Luoyang who heard third-hand accounts of Liu Wei's success and decided to become the authentic merchant poet of his city. Jiang's masterpiece was a 40-stanza epic called The Ballad of Tea Prices and My Ungrateful Customers, which he performed at the city's main marketplace during the busy morning rush. The poem included detailed complaints about specific customers by name, a lengthy explanation of his pricing strategy, and graphic descriptions of what he wanted to do to competitors who were undercutting his business. Jiang's performance attracted a crowd, not because people enjoyed his poetry, but because he was essentially hosting a public airing of local business grievances set to rhythmic verse. The situation escalated when one of his competitors, Wu the spice seller, interrupted the performance to defend himself, leading to what historians record as the first ever poetry battle involving actual merchandise being thrown. The event ended with Jiang and Wu composing increasingly hostile verses about each other, while their respective supporters pelted the opposing poet with tea leaves and peppercorns. The Luoyang tea poetry incident, as it became known, inspired similar merchant poetry conflicts across the region. Apparently, there's something about combining artistic expression with business complaints that brings out the absolute worst in people. Soon every market day featured competing poets, merchants trying to out-insult each other in verse form, turning routine commercial disputes into elaborate public entertainments that drew crowds but completely disrupted normal trading activities. Even more dramatic was the situation in Kaifeng, where a group of young scholars decided to form what they called the Authentic Experience Poetry Society. These were privileged urban kids who thought they could capture Liu Wei's appeal by writing about real life. But their version of real life involved complaining about their parents' expectations, the difficulty of imperial examinations, and how expensive good wine had become. Their leader, Li Qing, wrote a notorious piece called Ode to My Father's Disappointment in My Life Choices, which he performed at his own family's dinner party during Chinese New Year. The performance was so mortifyingly personal and inappropriate that 3 relatives stopped speaking to the family. 2 marriage negotiations were canceled, and Li Qing's father publicly disowned him in front of the entire extended family. But instead of learning from this disaster, Li Qing doubled down and started a touring show called Poetry That Ruins Family Relationships, which became wildly popular among other young people who were also looking for creative ways to rebel against parental authority. The most catastrophic example occurred in Yangzhou, where the local governor, Wang Shu, decided that his province needed its own version of Chang'an's poetry innovation. Wang was a career bureaucrat with absolutely no artistic ability but unlimited confidence in his own cultural sophistication. He organized what he called the Provincial Authentic Poetry Festival and invited poets from across the region to Whitewoods, demonstrate their connection to local life and values. What Wang didn't anticipate was that his invitation would attract every aspiring poet, failed scholar, and attention-seeking eccentric within 300 miles. The festival became a 3-day nightmare of increasingly bizarre performances as participants tried to out-authentic each other. One poet brought live goats on stage as props for his poem about animal husbandry. Another performed naked except for strategically placed vegetables to demonstrate his connection to agricultural cycles. A third poet insisted on delivering her entire 40-minute epic while standing in a tub of mud to represent the authentic farming experience. The festival reached its chaotic peak when multiple poets started performing simultaneously, each trying to be heard over the others, while their various animal props escaped into the audience and began causing havoc. The event ended with the governor's mansion partially flooded, several minor officials requiring medical attention after being trampled by confused livestock, and Wang Shu being reassigned to a remote border post where his cultural initiatives could do less damage to imperial dignity. But perhaps the most telling incident was in Suzhou, where a group of actual farmers heard about the poetry trend and decided to show these urban imitators what real rural poetry sounded like. Their leader, Old Chun, composed a piece called "You City People Don't Know Anything About Farming," which methodically destroyed every romantic rural cliché that had appeared in both traditional and Liu Wei-inspired poetry. The poem was technically better than anything Liu Wei had written, genuinely funny, and devastatingly accurate in its criticism of urban assumptions about rural life. The problem was that it was so good, it made everyone else's attempts at rural authenticity look ridiculous, including Liu Wei's original work. This pattern of cultural chaos wasn't isolated to individual cities. It was revealing something fundamental about how artistic movements spread and mutate in pre-modern societies. The Liu Wei effect was happening because the Tang Dynasty had created a cultural system so rigid and exclusive that when someone accidentally broke it open, the pent-up demand for authentic expression exploded in completely unpredictable directions. Other examples started appearing across the empire with depressing regularity. In Chengdu, a blacksmith started writing poems about metalworking, techniques that were so technically detailed they functioned better as instruction manuals than artistic expression. In Guangzhou, a group of fishermen began composing epic verses about sea conditions and fish migration patterns that were actually useful for navigation, but terrible as entertainment. In Xi'an, a baker achieved local fame with poems about bread that included precise measurements and baking temperatures, creating the world's first recipe poems. The pattern that emerged was clear. People were desperately hungry for poetry that connected to their daily lives, but most of them had no idea how to create that connection without either copying Liu Wei's specific approach or going so far in the opposite direction that their work became purely functional rather than artistic. The established poetry world had been so disconnected from normal human experience for so long that when people tried to bridge that gap, they often fell into it completely. Why this pattern existed came down to centuries of cultural gatekeeping that had convinced most people they weren't qualified to participate in artistic expression unless they could master an incredibly complex set of classical references and formal techniques. When Liu Wei accidentally proved that you could get attention and even respect for poetry that ignored all those rules, it gave everyone permission to try, but without any framework for understanding what made art both authentic and actually good. Most attempts devolved into either pure autobiography set to rhythm or occupational training disguised as verse. Social, political, and economic factors all played into this cultural explosion. Economically, the Tang Dynasty was prosperous enough that people had leisure time to experiment with artistic expression, but not educated enough to do it well. Politically, the government's tight control over official culture created pressure for alternative forms of expression that could emerge outside institutional approval. Socially, the rigid class system meant that most people had been excluded from cultural participation for generations. So when the barriers suddenly seemed permeable, everyone rushed through at once. Comparison to other time periods showed that this kind of cultural democratization disaster wasn't unique to Tang Dynasty China. Similar patterns appeared whenever exclusive artistic traditions suddenly became accessible to broader populations. The difference was that the Chinese bureaucratic system was so thoroughly documented that we have unusually detailed records of exactly how spectacularly things could go wrong when cultural gatekeeping collapsed without being replaced by any alternative quality control mechanisms. The effects of this literary chaos were far more significant than anyone anticipated, reshaping not just poetry but the entire relationship between official culture and popular expression across the Tang Dynasty. Who benefited from this cultural explosion was surprisingly complex. While established poets lost their monopoly on artistic authority, they also discovered new audiences who were suddenly interested in poetry as entertainment rather than just formal cultural obligation. Liu Wei himself benefited enormously, though he remained completely oblivious to his role as an accidental revolutionary. His terrible poetry had somehow made him the most famous poet in the empire, even though nobody could claim with a straight face that his work was actually good. He was like a literary anti-celebrity, famous precisely because he was so spectacularly bad at the thing he was famous for. Who suffered included regional governors, who found their jurisdictions overrun with amateur poets disrupting public order. Traditional poetry teachers whose students were abandoning classical forms for authentic expression. And anyone trying to maintain cultural standards in an environment where being deliberately awful had become a legitimate artistic strategy. The Imperial Poetry Bureau found itself in the impossible position of trying to regulate a cultural movement that was defined entirely by its rejection of regulation. The unintended consequences were everywhere and multiplying daily. Markets became poetry venues, disrupting commerce. Family gatherings turned into impromptu literary competitions that destroyed relationships. Religious ceremonies were interrupted by poets who thought their authentic spiritual expression trumped established ritual. Even government meetings weren't safe. Minor officials started incorporating verse into their reports, thinking it demonstrated cultural sophistication, but actually making administrative work completely incomprehensible. How? This shaped future developments became clear as the movement started consuming itself. The second generation of Liu Wei imitators were so bad they made the original look sophisticated, leading to a backlash where audiences started demanding higher standards even from authenticity-based poetry. This created space for genuinely talented writers who could combine authentic expression with actual artistic skill, ultimately producing some of the best poetry the Tang Dynasty ever created. Modern parallels were obvious to anyone watching the situation unfold. Just like contemporary social media movements that democratize content creation, but often sacrifice quality for accessibility, the rural poetry phenomenon showed how breaking down cultural barriers can unleash both creativity and chaos simultaneously. The same technology that allows authentic voices to reach audiences also enables terrible content to spread just as widely, creating a cultural ecosystem where merit and popularity don't always align. The lessons for understanding cultural change were profound. Genuine artistic movements can't be artificially created by institutions, but they also can't be easily controlled once they emerge organically. The most significant cultural shifts often come from unexpected sources and spread in unpredictable ways that challenge everyone's assumptions about how art, politics, and society interact. Sometimes the most important thing isn't whether the catalyst for change is good or bad, but whether the change itself creates space for better possibilities to emerge. Yet even as provincial poets were busy destroying public order with their enthusiastic embrace of authentic expression, a much more serious crisis was developing in Chang'an that would make local poetry riots look like minor entertainment. Liu Wei, still blissfully unaware that he had accidentally triggered a cultural revolution across the empire, was about to commit his most spectacular error yet. one that would transform his local reputation as a laughably bad poet into something approaching actual political danger. The transition to this next development began when news of the provincial poetry chaos reached the imperial court, where officials were starting to realize that what they had dismissed as harmless local entertainment was actually undermining governmental authority across multiple regions. When poets were disrupting markets, family gatherings, and even administrative functions, poetry stopped being a cultural issue and became a matter of public order and imperial control. Meanwhile, Liu Wei had finally achieved his dream of being invited to perform at an official court function, the emperor's birthday celebration, the most important cultural event of the year. What he didn't understand was that this invitation wasn't recognition of his artistic merit, but rather a setup designed to use his obvious incompetence as comic relief to demonstrate the superiority of traditional court culture. The Imperial Poetry Bureau thought they could contain and control the authenticity movement by showcasing its most ridiculous representative in a context where proper poetry would clearly triumph. They were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous performer is someone who takes the stage. Without understanding they're supposed to be the joke dot by the autumn of 847 CE, the situation had reached a breaking point that nobody in the imperial court had anticipated when they first decided to mock Liu Wei's poetry for their own entertainment. What had started as a simple plan to showcase the superiority of traditional court culture by contrasting it with obvious peasant incompetence was about to become the most diplomatically disastrous cultural event in Tang Dynasty history. The key players involved included Emperor Xuanzong himself, 3 foreign ambassadors who were visiting for the birthday celebration, the entire Imperial Poetry Bureau, and Liu Wei, who remained the only person in Chang'an who didn't understand that he was walking into a carefully orchestrated public humiliation. The description of tensions and problems swirling around this event was like watching multiple disasters converge into one perfect storm of political chaos. The emperor was already irritated by reports of poetry-related civil disturbances across his provinces and wanted to demonstrate that the court maintained proper cultural control. The Poetry Bureau was desperate to reassert their authority after months of being upstaged by amateur poets who couldn't tell a classical allusion from a grocery list. Foreign diplomats were attending specifically to evaluate Tang cultural sophistication as part of ongoing trade negotiations, making this exactly the wrong time for any kind of cultural embarrassment. The stakes involved were far higher than anyone realized. This wasn't just about whether Liu Wei would embarrass himself again. It was about imperial dignity, international relations, and the fundamental question of whether the Tang Dynasty could maintain cultural authority in an era when their own subjects were openly mocking traditional artistic standards. The birthday celebration was being attended by ambassadors from Korea, Japan, and the Western Turkic Khaganate, all of whom were already skeptical about Chinese claims of cultural superiority and were looking for any sign that the Tang Dynasty was losing control of their own civilization. What made this particularly volatile was that Liu Wei had been specifically invited to perform his authentic rural poetry as what the court organizers assumed would be harmless comic relief, a brief, obviously inferior performance that would make the real poets look even more sophisticated by comparison. They had no idea that Liu Wei had spent weeks preparing what he considered his masterpiece, a birthday poem for the emperor that incorporated everything he had learned about imperial dignity, diplomatic protocol, and cross-cultural appreciation. The result would be spectacular in all the worst possible ways. The imperial birthday banquet began with all the pomp and ceremony befitting the most important cultural event of the year, held in the magnificent Damning Palace with its soaring ceilings, golden pillars, and elaborate decorations that had taken months to prepare. The foreign ambassadors sat in places of honor, dressed in their finest ceremonial robes and clearly impressed by the display of Tang wealth and sophistication. Traditional court poets had already delivered appropriately reverent verses comparing the emperor to the sun, moon, and various mythical dragons, setting exactly the tone of refined cultural authority that the court wanted to project. Then Liu Wei took the stage, wearing what he believed was formal court attire, but was actually a patchwork robe made from fabric scraps that he had sewn together himself because he couldn't afford proper ceremonial clothing. His confidence was absolutely unshakable as he bowed to the emperor and announced that he would be performing a universal birthday song for his imperial majesty that celebrates the friendship of all nations through the common language of agricultural wisdom. The build-up to disaster was visible to everyone except Liu Wei himself. Court officials exchanged nervous glances as he began arranging what appeared to be vegetables on a performance platform as cultural props representing the international harmony of farming techniques. The Korean ambassador leaned forward with interest, apparently thinking this was some sophisticated Tang artistic tradition he didn't understand. The Japanese diplomat started taking notes, assuming this was an important cultural ceremony that would require reporting back to his superiors. Liu Wei began his performance with what he considered a sophisticated international perspective. Great Emperor, like a magnificent turnip that grows in soil enriched by many different kinds of manure, your wisdom draws strength from the diverse agricultural traditions of all the kingdoms. He gestured enthusiastically toward the Korean ambassador while holding up an actual turnip. Just as our Korean friends understand the deep connection between cabbage cultivation and political stability, the key moment when everything went catastrophically wrong was when Liu Wei, warming to his theme of international agricultural cooperation, decided to incorporate what he believed were traditional greeting customs from each represented nation. For Korea, he performed what he thought was a traditional bow while chanting about kimchi fermentation techniques. For Japan, he attempted a ceremonial tea preparation using actual dirt instead of tea leaves to represent the authentic earth connection that unites all farmers across the seas. But the climax of cultural disaster came when he addressed the Western Turkic ambassador with a poem comparing the emperor's military prowess to a mighty stallion who could mount any mare in the grasslands, from the Korean highlands to the Japanese islands to the Turkish steppes, spreading his noble seed across the fertile territories of lesser rulers. The entire hall fell into stunned silence as Liu Wei continued with increasingly explicit agricultural metaphors that somehow managed to insult every foreign delegation simultaneously, while also suggesting that their kingdoms were merely breeding stock for Tang imperial ambitions. The unexpected development that transformed this from mere cultural embarrassment into diplomatic crisis was that Liu Wei, completely misreading the audience's horrified silence as respectful attention, decided to expand his performance into what he called a musical collaboration celebrating our shared humanity. He started making what he believed were traditional music sounds from each represented culture: barnyard animal noises for Korea, slurping sounds for Japan, and hoarse whinnying for the Turkish delegation. The performance reached its absolutely catastrophic peak when Liu Wei invited the foreign ambassadors to join him on stage for a harmony of international agricultural cooperation through interpretive farming dance. When they politely declined, he assumed they were being modest and decided to represent all their cultures himself through an interpretive dance routine that involved him crawling around on the floor, making planting motions while singing about plowing the fertile diplomatic fields of friendship in increasingly inappropriate metaphors. The immediate aftermath was unlike anything in recorded Tang Dynasty diplomatic history. The Korean ambassador stood up and walked out in the middle of the performance, followed immediately by the Japanese delegation. The Turkish ambassador remained seated, but was visibly writing what appeared to be very detailed notes about this spectacular display of Tang cultural sophistication. The emperor sat frozen in absolute horror as Liu Wei concluded his performance by presenting his imperial majesty with an actual turnip, as a symbol of the deep roots of international friendship, and asking if he could schedule regular performances to help maintain diplomatic relationships through agricultural poetry. The silence that followed, Liu Wei's bow and expectant smile, lasted for what felt like eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds before Emperor Xuanzong managed to gesture for the palace guards to escort the performer away. Liu Wei left the stage beaming with satisfaction, completely convinced that his innovative approach to diplomatic cultural exchange had been a tremendous success, evidenced by how speechless he had rendered the entire audience. He had no idea that he had just single-handedly created the most embarrassing diplomatic incident of the emperor's entire reign, or that the court officials were already frantically trying to figure out how to explain this disaster to foreign governments without starting multiple international conflicts. The response was immediate, unprecedented, and completely catastrophic for Tang Dynasty international relations. Within hours, the Korean ambassador had sent a formal complaint to the emperor, describing Liu Wei's performance as a deliberate insult to Korean cultural dignity disguised as primitive entertainment, demanding both an official apology and assurance that such displays would never be repeated. The Japanese delegation went further, interpreting the entire event as a calculated demonstration of Tang contempt for Japanese civilization and threatening to reconsider all pending trade agreements. Most seriously, the Western Turkic ambassadors report back to his Khan described the performance as evidence that the Tang Dynasty had become so decadent and culturally confused that they could no longer distinguish between diplomacy and barnyard entertainment. This report would later be used to justify increased military pressure on Tang western borders, turning Liu Wei's birthday poem into an indirect cause of border conflicts that would persist for years. The various parties' reactions revealed just how completely Liu Wei had misunderstood everything about international relations, cultural sensitivity, and basic human decency. Emperor Xuanzong's immediate response was to ban Liu Wei from all future court events and launch an investigation into how such an obviously inappropriate performer had been allowed anywhere near a diplomatic function. The Poetry Bureau, desperate to distance themselves from the disaster, issued public statements claiming that Liu Wei's performance represented unauthorized cultural expression that had nothing to do with official Tang artistic traditions. The immediate consequences rippled through every level of government and society. Foreign trade negotiations were suspended pending resolution of the diplomatic crisis. Regional governors received emergency instructions about maintaining cultural dignity and preventing any similar incidents in their jurisdictions. The entire court poetry system was restructured to prevent unauthorized performers from accessing official events, effectively ending the brief period when cultural gatekeeping had seemed to be loosening. The political and social fallout transformed Liu Wei overnight from a harmless local eccentric into a genuine threat to imperial stability. Palace security was increased around all cultural events. The Poetry Bureau implemented new screening procedures that were so restrictive they effectively eliminated any possibility of cultural innovation or authentic expression in official contexts. The imperial government's reputation for cultural sophistication, which had taken centuries to establish, was severely damaged by one disastrous hour of turnip-waving agricultural poetry. Most ironically, the outcomes were exactly the opposite of what everyone had intended. The court had wanted to use Liu Wei's obvious incompetence to demonstrate the superiority of traditional culture, but instead had created an international incident that made the entire Tang establishment look incompetent. Liu Wei had wanted to promote international friendship, through shared agricultural wisdom, but had inadvertently insulted three foreign powers simultaneously. The Poetry Bureau had hoped to reassert cultural authority, but instead had been forced to acknowledge that their screening process was so inadequate it had allowed a diplomatic disaster to unfold in front of the emperor himself. This catastrophic birthday celebration wasn't just a single embarrassing incident. It was a perfect crystallization of everything that had gone wrong with Tang Dynasty cultural politics over the previous months, revealing deeper problems that no amount of damage control could completely address. What the emperor's birthday disaster exposed about the system was that the entire imperial cultural establishment had become so disconnected from reality that they couldn't even recognize obvious incompetence when it was performing turnip dances. On the palace floor, the deeper meaning of Liu Wei's diplomatic destruction went beyond individual embarrassment to fundamental questions about cultural authority and imperial legitimacy. If the Tang court couldn't maintain basic standards at their most important ceremonial events, what did that say about their ability to govern effectively? If their cultural screening process was so broken that international relations could be destroyed by one confused farmer with a turnip, how could anyone trust their judgment on more serious matters? What this revealed about Tang society was that the gap between official culture and popular understanding had grown so wide that communication between different social levels had become essentially impossible. Liu Wei genuinely thought he was honoring the emperor and promoting international friendship, because nobody had ever successfully explained to him how court culture actually worked. The Poetry Bureau thought they could control authentic expression by putting it on display in a contained context, not understanding that authenticity can't be controlled without destroying what makes it authentic in the first place. Long-term effects were already becoming visible as foreign governments reassessed their relationships with a dynasty that apparently couldn't distinguish between cultural celebration and international insult. Why historians still debate this incident centuries later is because it represents a perfect case study in how cultural misunderstanding can escalate into political crisis, and how attempts to maintain traditional authority in changing times can backfire spectacularly when those in power lose touch with social reality. The broader implications would reshape not just Tang cultural policy, but the entire relationship between imperial authority and popular expression for generations to come. Liu Wei had accidentally proven that cultural power, like political power, depends ultimately on public confidence, and that confidence, once lost through spectacular incompetence, is extremely difficult to recover. Around Liu Wei's spectacular cultural destruction, a fascinating cast of secondary characters found themselves unwillingly swept into the chaos, each representing different aspects of how one man's terrible poetry could reshape an entire civilization's relationship with artistic expression. These weren't just innocent bystanders. They were active participants in a cultural crisis that nobody had seen coming, and nobody knew how to resolve. Master Wang Dejing, the 73-year-old head of the Imperial Poetry Bureau, was perhaps the most tragic figure in this entire saga. Wang had dedicated his entire life to preserving traditional poetry standards, spending 50 years carefully maintaining the delicate balance between innovation and tradition that kept court culture functioning smoothly. He was the kind of meticulous bureaucrat who could recite the precise protocol for every type of imperial poetry event, and had personally overseen thousands of cultural ceremonies without a single significant incident. Then, Liu Wei happened to his carefully ordered world like a literary earthquake, and Wang's final years became a desperate struggle to contain damage that kept spreading faster than he could address it. Wang's story was heartbreaking in its mundane tragedy. This wasn't some grand conflict between artistic visions, but rather a competent administrator watching his life's work collapse. because nobody had prepared him for the possibility that someone might show up to an imperial banquet with vegetables and start making animal noises as diplomatic outreach. His daily routine shifted from reviewing poetry submissions and scheduling court readings to frantically writing damage control reports and trying to explain to increasingly furious foreign ambassadors why the Tang Dynasty's cultural screening process had failed so spectacularly. The man who had once been respected as the empire's foremost authority on proper artistic expression was now spending his days writing official memos with subject lines like the turnip incident diplomatic, apology protocol, and emergency guidelines for preventing future agricultural poetry disasters. On the completely opposite end of the spectrum was Chang'an, a 24-year-old junior poet who became Liu Wei's most enthusiastic disciple and somehow managed to be even worse at poetry than his inspiration. Chen represented the dangerous combination of youthful idealism and complete artistic incompetence that Liu Wei's example had unleashed across the empire. Unlike Liu Wei, who was authentically rural and genuinely didn't understand court culture, Chen was an urban intellectual who had deliberately chosen to embrace authentic expression as a form of rebellion against his privileged background. His poetry was fake authenticity performed by someone who had never experienced genuine hardship but thought he could capture it through sufficiently dramatic displays of artistic suffering. Chen's story illustrated how Liu Wei's influence could corrupt even well-intentioned artistic impulses. His masterpiece, Ballad of My Imaginary Peasant Childhood, was a 40-stanza epic about rural poverty written by someone whose biggest hardship had been choosing between silk and cotton robes. He performed his piece while deliberately wearing rags and refusing to wash for weeks beforehand to achieve what he called authentic agricultural aromatics. The performance was so offensively fake that it managed to insult both urban sophisticates who recognized his pretension and actual rural people who resented having their real struggles turned into privileged performance art. The third crucial figure was Lady Jiang Maifeng, the emperor's cultural advisor, who found herself in the impossible position of trying to explain to international diplomats why the Tang Dynasty's cultural policies had produced a poet who thought turnip metaphors were appropriate diplomatic language. Jiang was one of the few people in the imperial court who actually understood both traditional culture and popular trends, making her uniquely qualified to see exactly how catastrophic Liu Wei's influence had become. She represented the voice of reasonable cultural compromise, someone who could appreciate authentic expression without abandoning all standards, and who understood that cultural gatekeeping needed reform without believing that all rules should be eliminated. Jiang's significance lay in her role as the person trying to find practical solutions to an essentially absurd problem. While Master Wang was having nervous breakdowns about protocol violations, and Chen was writing increasingly ridiculous fake authentic poetry, Jiang was quietly developing new cultural policies that could accommodate genuine popular expression without allowing international incidents caused by vegetable-wielding performance artists. Her behind-the-scenes work to rebuild Tang cultural credibility would prove more important than anyone realized at the time. But during the immediate crisis, she was just another exhausted official trying to prevent one man's terrible poetry from destroying centuries of diplomatic relationships. These weren't isolated incidents scattered across the empire. They were part of an increasingly complex web of relationships and consequences that showed how cultural movements spread through personal networks, professional connections, and pure coincidence in ways that no central authority could predict or control. The stories connected through a combination of official channels, informal artistic networks, and sheer bad luck that created feedback loops of cultural chaos. Master Wang's attempts to contain Liu Wei's influence directly created the conditions that allowed Chen Luming to flourish as a fake authentic poet. When Wang issued official guidelines prohibiting unauthorized agricultural metaphors and inappropriate rural references in court poetry, he inadvertently created a market for exactly those things in unofficial venues. Chen saw this as an opportunity to position himself as a leader of the authentic expression movement, setting up underground poetry events specifically designed to violate Wang's new cultural restrictions. The web of relationships became even more complicated when Chen's performances started attracting the attention of foreign spies who were trying to understand whether Liu Wei's diplomatic disaster represented a deliberate Tang cultural strategy or just accidental incompetence. Chen's deliberately provocative, fake authentic poetry convinced several foreign intelligence networks that the Tang Dynasty was using peasant cultural expression as a form of psychological warfare designed to confuse and destabilize international relations. This led to a series of increasingly paranoid international responses that had nothing to do with Liu Wei's original innocent stupidity, but everything to do with Chen's calculated exploitation of cultural confusion. Lady Jiang found herself caught in the middle of these escalating misunderstandings, trying to explain to foreign diplomats that Chen's performances were unauthorized rebellion against Liu Wei's accidental influence, which itself was unauthorized rebellion against traditional court culture. Her diplomatic correspondence from this period reads like someone trying to untangle a knot while more people keep adding strings. Every attempt to clarify one aspect of the cultural crisis created new confusion about other aspects. Political and social networks amplified these problems in unexpected ways. Wang's emergency cultural restrictions were being enforced by regional governors who had their own local poetry problems to deal with, creating a system where different provinces were implementing different versions of anti-Liu Wei policies that sometimes contradicted each other. Meanwhile, Chen's underground poetry movement was inspiring copycat rebels in other cities who didn't understand the original context but were eager to participate in what they thought was a coordinated resistance movement against cultural authority. How one event led to another created a cascade of unintended consequences that nobody could have predicted. Liu Wei's birthday disaster convinced Emperor Xuanzong that cultural innovation was inherently dangerous, leading to policies that drove authentic artistic expression underground. Chen's fake authentic rebellion against those policies convinced foreign observers that the Tang Dynasty was deliberately promoting cultural chaos as a political strategy. Lady Jiang's attempts to reassure international partners that the government had everything under control inadvertently confirmed foreign suspicions that there was indeed a coordinated cultural policy behind all the apparent chaos. The unintended consequences and connections reached into areas that had nothing to do with poetry, but everything to do with political stability. Regional governors started reporting that their local poetry problems were connected to broader questions about imperial authority and popular compliance. Foreign trade partners began incorporating cultural stability clauses into commercial agreements, essentially requiring the Tang Dynasty to guarantee that their trading partners wouldn't be subjected to surprise agricultural poetry performances. Military commanders on border regions found themselves dealing with international tensions that had originated from a birthday party but were now affecting actual diplomatic and security relationships. Perhaps most ironically, the interconnected web of reactions to Liu Wei's original incompetence was creating exactly the kind of coordinated cultural resistance movement that foreign observers suspected, but that had never actually existed. Chen's fake rebellion was inspiring real rebels. Wang's restrictions were creating genuine underground poetry networks, and Jiang's diplomatic explanations were accidentally providing a framework for what a deliberate cultural strategy might look like. Liu Wei had accidentally created not just a cultural crisis, but a cultural resistance movement that was becoming real even though it had started as a series of misunderstandings about someone who just wanted to write poems about chickens. To understand how Liu Wei's poetry disasters could reshape an entire empire's cultural landscape, you have to understand the daily life, beliefs, and social structures that made Tang Dynasty society so vulnerable to this particular kind of chaos. This wasn't just about one bad poet. It was about how cultural authority functioned in a civilization where artistic expression was directly connected to political legitimacy and social order. Daily life in Tang Dynasty China was structured around elaborate hierarchies that determined everything from what you wore to what subjects you were allowed to discuss in public. Poetry wasn't just entertainment. It was a marker of education, social status, and political reliability. Being able to compose appropriate verses for ceremonial occasions was a basic requirement for anyone hoping to advance in government service, conduct serious business negotiations, or marry into respectable families. When Liu Wei started proving that you could gain attention and even fame through completely inappropriate poetry, he was accidentally challenging the entire social system that used cultural competence as a measure of personal worth. The beliefs and attitudes of the time made this disruption even more significant. Tang society had convinced itself that artistic sophistication was both a cause and a result of political stability, that maintaining high cultural standards was essential for imperial legitimacy and international respect. This meant that cultural failures weren't just embarrassing entertainment mishaps, but potential threats to governmental authority. When foreign ambassadors witnessed Liu Wei's turnip performance, they weren't just seeing bad poetry. They were seeing evidence that the Tang Dynasty might be losing the cultural control that justified their political power. Social structures amplified every aspect of the crisis because Tang society was organized around the assumption that cultural gatekeepers could successfully distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate expression. The Poetry Bureau wasn't just a cultural organization. It was part of the governmental apparatus that maintained social order through artistic regulation. When that system failed to prevent international diplomatic incidents caused by agricultural poetry, it raised fundamental questions about whether any aspect of imperial administration could be trusted to function properly. What was normal versus exceptional in this context made Liu Wei's impact even more dramatic. Normal cultural expression was so carefully regulated and predictable that even minor deviations from established patterns were noteworthy. Exceptional cultural events were supposed to be controlled demonstrations of imperial magnificence, not chaotic disasters that required diplomatic damage control. Liu Wei's poetry existed in a category that the social system couldn't process. It was too obviously incompetent to be officially acceptable, but too popular and authentic to be easily dismissed as irrelevant. How this cultural context shaped events was crucial to understanding why one man's bad poetry could cause such widespread disruption. In a society where cultural competence was a requirement for social participation and political legitimacy, Liu Wei's success through cultural incompetence represented a fundamental challenge to the basic assumptions that held the system together. His influence wasn't just changing poetry. It was accidentally demonstrating that the entire structure of cultural authority might be based on artificial distinctions that had nothing to do with actual artistic value or popular appeal. Perhaps most absurd was the fundamental irony that Liu Wei, the worst poet in the Tang Dynasty, had accidentally become the most influential cultural figure of his generation through the simple expedient of being so spectacularly bad that he couldn't be ignored. While traditionally accomplished poets struggled for recognition and spent years mastering classical forms that barely anyone understood, Liu Wei achieved empire-wide fame by writing poems about chickens and performing interpretive turnip dances. For foreign diplomats, the examples of contradictions were everywhere and multiplying daily. The Poetry Bureau's attempts to maintain cultural standards by restricting authentic expression created a black market for exactly the kind of terrible poetry they were trying to eliminate. Foreign diplomats who came to Chang'an expecting to witness sophisticated Tang cultural superiority instead found themselves taking notes on agricultural performance art that they assumed must represent some advanced artistic tradition they didn't understand. Students who had spent years learning proper poetic techniques discovered that audiences were more interested in hearing about someone's actual life experiences, even when those experiences were described through objectively awful verse. How things weren't what they seemed became the defining characteristic of the entire cultural crisis. Liu Wei's poetry was supposed to be harmless comic relief, but it triggered international diplomatic incidents. Chen Luming's fake authentic rebellion was intended to challenge cultural authority, but it ended up reinforcing foreign stereotypes about Tang cultural chaos. Master Wang's emergency restrictions were designed to restore order, but they created underground poetry movements that were more disruptive than the original problem. Lady Jiang's diplomatic explanations were meant to reassure international partners, but they accidentally provided a framework for what a coordinated cultural strategy might look like. Modern parallels to these contradictions were obvious to anyone familiar with how social movements develop and spread in complex societies. Just like contemporary situations where attempts to control viral content often make it more popular, or where fake authenticity can become more influential than genuine expression. The Tang Dynasty's poetry crisis showed how institutional attempts to manage cultural change often create exactly the problems they're trying to prevent. The most profound contradiction was that Liu Wei's complete ignorance of cultural rules was producing more genuine cultural innovation than centuries of careful adherence to traditional artistic standards. His terrible poetry was accidentally proving that authenticity and popular appeal might be more important than technical competence and official approval, a lesson that the established cultural authority couldn't acknowledge without undermining their entire basis for existence. Everything changed when Emperor Xuanzong finally lost his patience with the entire poetry situation and issued what would become known as the Great Cultural Edict of 848. A comprehensive reform of imperial artistic policy that was triggered by one final, absolutely catastrophic incident involving Liu Wei, a visiting Tibetan trade delegation, and what historians diplomatically refer to as the Great Yak Poetry Disaster. The background to this change was that despite months of damage control, diplomatic restrictions, and increasingly desperate attempts by the Poetry Bureau to contain Liu Wei's influence, the cultural chaos was only getting worse. The specific incident that broke the emperor's patience occurred when Liu Wei, still completely oblivious to his role in destroying Tang international relations, volunteered to welcome a Tibetan trading party with what he called a song of mountain friendship through shared animal husbandry wisdom. This performance involved Liu Wei attempting to demonstrate his respect for Tibetan culture by imitating what he believed were traditional yak herding calls, while reciting a poem comparing the emperor's wisdom to deep, nourishing qualities of yak cheese aged in mountain caves. The Tibetan delegates, who had arrived in Chang'an specifically to negotiate increased trade relationships, interpreted this as either a deliberate insult or evidence that the Tang Dynasty had completely lost touch with diplomatic reality. Why this moment was different from all of Liu Wei's previous disasters was that it happened in front of the emperor himself, who had been assured by his advisors that the peasant poet problem had been resolved through proper administrative controls. Watching Liu Wei make yak noises at important trade partners while waving what appeared to be cheese props made from actual dairy products was the moment when Xuanzong realized that his government's cultural policies weren't just failing, they were actively undermining imperial authority in ways that couldn't be explained away or diplomatically smoothed over. The key factors that led to this transformation included the accumulation of international incidents that were making the Tang Dynasty look incompetent to foreign observers, the spread of copycat authentic poetry movements that were disrupting local governance across multiple provinces, and the growing realization that traditional cultural gatekeeping methods were completely inadequate for managing popular artistic expression in an era when anyone could achieve fame through spectacular public failure. Most importantly, the emperor's advisors had finally compiled a comprehensive report showing that Liu Wei's influence wasn't declining despite months of official discouragement. It was actually growing stronger as his reputation spread to regions where people had only heard second-hand accounts of his performances and assumed his fame meant he must be doing something right. The report included documented cases of Liu Wei-inspired poetry causing public disturbances in over 20 cities, 3 separate international complaints about Tang cultural degradation, and evidence that underground poetry networks were using Liu Wei's example to justify increasingly radical departures from traditional artistic standards. The transformation became inevitable when Lady Jiang presented the emperor with a stark choice: either implement fundamental reforms that could accommodate authentic popular expression within official cultural frameworks, or continue fighting a losing battle against cultural change that was happening whether the government approved of it or not. The emperor chose reform, but his version of reform would prove to be far more dramatic and comprehensive than anyone had anticipated, essentially restructuring the entire relationship between imperial authority and artistic expression across the Tang Dynasty. How the change unfolded was far more complex and chaotic than the simple imperial edict that announced it, involving months of bureaucratic infighting, policy experimentation, and unintended consequences that nobody had predicted. When the reform process began, the Great Cultural Edict wasn't just a single policy decision. It was the visible result of a massive governmental reorganization that touched every aspect of how the Tang Dynasty managed cultural expression, artistic education, and public entertainment. Resistance to change came from predictable sources, but in surprisingly creative forms. The Poetry Bureau, facing the elimination of their traditional gatekeeping role, launched what amounted to a bureaucratic guerrilla campaign against the new policies. Master Wang and his supporters began implementing the new inclusive cultural guidelines in ways that were technically compliant but practically useless, creating application processes for authentic expression permits that were so complicated they effectively prevented anyone from participating, and establishing popular poetry evaluation committees staffed entirely with traditional poets who could be counted on to reject anything that didn't conform to classical standards. Champions of change emerged from unexpected quarters, including several regional governors who had been dealing with Liu Wei-inspired poetry riots and were desperate for any policy framework that might restore order to their jurisdictions. Lady Jiang became the unofficial leader of the reform faction, not because she supported Liu Wei's poetry, which she considered genuinely terrible, but because she understood that fighting popular cultural movements was less effective than finding ways to channel them constructively. The specific steps and stages of implementation revealed just how unprepared the imperial government was for managing cultural change at this scale. The first phase involved creating regional cultural diversity offices that were supposed to identify and promote local artistic traditions while maintaining appropriate standards. The second phase established popular expression integration programs designed to provide training for amateur poets who wanted to perform at official events. The third phase created international cultural sensitivity protocols, specifically designed to prevent future diplomatic incidents caused by inappropriate agricultural poetry. Obstacles encountered during implementation were both practical and philosophical. ranging from simple logistical problems, like finding enough qualified staff to run the new cultural programs, to fundamental disagreements about whether authentic artistic expression could be improved through institutional training, without destroying what made it authentic in the first place. Regional governors complained that they didn't have the resources to implement complex cultural diversity programs while also maintaining basic administrative functions. Traditional poets argued that lowering standards to accommodate popular expression would ultimately destroy the artistic traditions that made Tang culture worth preserving. Breakthrough moments came when several experimental programs started producing unexpectedly positive results. The popular expression integration program in Luoyang, despite being designed primarily to contain potential Liu Wei imitators, actually discovered several genuinely talented amateur poets whose work combined authentic life experience with improving technical skills. The Regional Cultural Diversity Office in Chengdu found ways to incorporate local artistic traditions into official ceremonies that enhanced rather than disrupted diplomatic protocols. Most significantly, the international cultural sensitivity protocols, which had been created specifically to prevent more turnip-related diplomatic disasters, accidentally established a framework for cultural exchange that impressed foreign observers. Instead of trying to hide cultural diversity within the empire, the new protocols celebrated it as evidence of Tang governmental sophistication and inclusive administrative policies. Foreign diplomats who had been questioning Tang cultural competence after the birthday banquet disaster began reporting that the dynasty's ability to adapt and reform their cultural policies demonstrated exactly the kind of flexibility and wisdom that made them reliable international partners. The role of individuals versus larger forces in driving this change was complex and often contradictory. While Liu Wei's individual incompetence had triggered the crisis, the solutions came from systematic policy development by people like Lady Zhang, who understood both traditional culture and popular trends. The emperor's personal frustration with diplomatic embarrassment was crucial for authorizing comprehensive reform, but the actual implementation depended on hundreds of regional officials who had to figure out how to make abstract policy changes work in specific local contexts. Perhaps most ironically, the role of larger historical forces became clear only in retrospect. The Tang Dynasty was experiencing economic prosperity and territorial expansion that was bringing diverse populations and cultural traditions into contact with imperial administrative systems that had been designed for a more homogeneous society. Liu Wei's poetry disasters had simply made visible cultural tensions that were already developing across the empire as economic and social changes created new forms of artistic expression that didn't fit traditional regulatory frameworks. The cultural edict wasn't just a response to one man's terrible poetry. It was an attempt to create governmental policies that could accommodate the cultural diversity that was becoming an inevitable feature of Tang Dynasty society. The new system that emerged from the Great Cultural Edict was unlike anything the Tang Dynasty had ever attempted, essentially creating parallel tracks for cultural expression that could accommodate both traditional artistic excellence and popular authentic expression without forcing them to compete directly for the same audiences or official recognition. This represented a fundamental shift from the previous approach of using cultural gatekeeping to maintain social hierarchy, toward a more complex system that tried to balance artistic standards with inclusive participation. How things were different became apparent immediately in the daily operations of cultural institutions across the empire. The Poetry Bureau was restructured into the Imperial Cultural Coordination Office, which maintained authority over official ceremonial events, but no longer claimed exclusive control over all forms of poetic expression. Regional cultural diversity offices were established in major cities with the authority to organize local cultural events. provide training for amateur artists, and serve as intermediaries between popular cultural movements and imperial administrative requirements. Most importantly, the new system created formal categories for different types of cultural expression that could be officially recognized without being held to identical standards. Imperial ceremonial poetry remained subject to traditional requirements for classical education and formal technical skill. Education and formal technical skill. Regional cultural expression could incorporate local traditions, dialects, and subject matter that would have been completely inappropriate for court events. Popular artistic innovation provided a framework for experimental work that might challenge traditional forms but contributed to cultural development. Who won and who lost under the new system reflected the complexity of cultural change that couldn't be reduced to simple victories or defeats. Traditional poets maintained their status and authority within imperial ceremonial contexts, but lost their exclusive claim to represent all legitimate artistic expression. Amateur poets gained official recognition and opportunities for training and performance, but were required to meet basic competency standards that eliminated the most spectacularly inappropriate performances that had characterized the Liu Wei era. Regional governors. One significantly increased cultural autonomy that allowed them to address local artistic traditions and tensions without waiting for imperial approval, but they also became responsible for maintaining cultural standards that could withstand international scrutiny. Foreign diplomats gained assurance that future cultural events would meet basic diplomatic protocol requirements, but they also had to adapt to a more complex cultural landscape where Tang artistic expression could legitimately include everything, from classical court poetry to regional folk traditions. The new rules and norms established clear boundaries for different types of cultural expression while creating mechanisms for movement between categories as artists developed their skills and understanding. Popular poets could receive training that would qualify them for regional cultural events, and exceptional regional artists could potentially gain recognition for imperial ceremonial participation. However, the system also established firm standards for diplomatic cultural events that were designed specifically to prevent future international incidents. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically revealed both the flexibility and limitations of the new approach. The fundamental structure of imperial cultural authority remained intact. The emperor and his designated officials still determined cultural policy and maintained ultimate authority over artistic expression. Traditional poetry education and classical cultural knowledge retained their importance for governmental service and high-status social participation. However, what changed dramatically was the recognition that cultural authority could be exercised through inclusion and diversity, rather than exclusion and uniformity. The new system acknowledged that authentic artistic expression could enhance rather than threaten imperial legitimacy, provided it was channeled through appropriate institutional frameworks that maintained diplomatic and administrative functionality. Perhaps most significantly, the new reality recognized that cultural change was inevitable and ongoing, requiring governmental policies that can adapt to evolving artistic movements rather than simply trying to preserve static traditional forms. This represented a fundamental shift from viewing cultural innovation as inherently threatening to seeing it as a potential source of imperial strength and international distinction. Was this change a positive development for Tang Dynasty culture and governance? The answer depends entirely on what criteria you use for evaluation, and different perspectives produce dramatically different assessments of whether the Great Cultural Edict represented enlightened reform or dangerous abandonment of traditional standards. From a diplomatic standpoint, the reforms were undeniably successful. International incidents caused by inappropriate cultural expression essentially disappeared, and foreign observers began commenting favorably on Tang cultural sophistication and administrative flexibility. Different perspectives on the cultural impact revealed deeper disagreements about the purpose and value of artistic expression in imperial society. Traditional cultural authorities argued that lowering standards to accommodate popular expression would inevitably lead to the degradation of artistic excellence and the loss of cultural traditions that had taken centuries to develop. They pointed out that Liu Wei's poetry was objectively terrible regardless of its popularity, and worried that institutional recognition of authentic expression would discourage the disciplined study and practice required for genuine artistic achievement. Popular cultural advocates countered that the previous system had been so exclusive and disconnected from ordinary life that it had become culturally irrelevant except as a marker of social status. They argued that the new system's recognition of diverse forms of expression had revitalized public interest in poetry and artistic participation, creating opportunities for cultural development that had been impossible under the old gatekeeping approach. Short-term versus long-term effects showed interesting patterns that complicated simple evaluations of success or failure. In the immediate aftermath of the reforms, there was definitely a period of cultural confusion as people tried to understand the new categories and standards for different types of artistic expression. Some traditionalists worried that the end of exclusive cultural authority would lead to complete artistic chaos, while some popular cultural enthusiasts were disappointed that the new system still maintained standards and boundaries that limited authentic expression. Long-term effects proved more positive than critics had anticipated, but also more complex than supporters had hoped. The Tang Dynasty did maintain its international cultural reputation while becoming more inclusive of diverse artistic traditions. However, the new system also created new forms of cultural bureaucracy and institutional complexity that sometimes hindered rather than helped artistic innovation. Unintended consequences included the development of professional cultural mediators, who specialized in helping amateur artists navigate the new system, and the emergence of authenticity consultants, who helped traditional artists incorporate popular elements into their work. Most ironically, the new system's success in preventing diplomatic disasters meant that Liu Wei's original influence gradually faded as people lost interest in agricultural poetry that wasn't causing international incidents. Modern judgment versus contemporary views reflected the difficulty of evaluating cultural change while it's still happening. Contemporary observers were divided between those who saw the reforms as necessary adaptation to changing social conditions and those who viewed them as capitulation to mob rule disguised as cultural democracy. In the years and decades that followed the Great Cultural Edict of 848, the Tang Dynasty's bold experiment in cultural inclusivity produced results that nobody had anticipated, creating a completely new landscape of artistic expression that was simultaneously more diverse, more regulated, and more bureaucratically complex than anything the empire had ever attempted to manage. The immediate aftermath revealed that reforming cultural policy was significantly easier than actually implementing cultural reform, especially when that reform had been triggered by diplomatic disasters involving agricultural poetry and required ongoing management of artistic movements that nobody fully understood. How things developed over the following decade showed that the new system's success created its own unique problems. The regional cultural diversity offices, which had been established to manage local artistic traditions and prevent future Liu Wei-style disasters, became so popular that they were overwhelmed with applications from aspiring poets who thought authentic expression meant they could achieve fame by being deliberately terrible. This led to the unintended consequence of creating a new form of cultural gatekeeping, where officials have to develop criteria for distinguishing between genuine authentic expression and calculated attempts to exploit the system for personal gain. New challenges emerged as the reformed cultural system attracted international attention that brought both opportunities and complications. Foreign diplomats who had initially been horrified by Liu Wei's turnip performances began requesting demonstrations of Tang cultural diversity as part of official diplomatic visits, forcing imperial cultural coordinators to create sanitized versions of popular artistic expression that could showcase imperial inclusivity without risking new international incidents. This led to the development of what critics called performance authenticity, officially approved demonstrations of popular culture that were technically genuine but carefully controlled to meet diplomatic requirements. The evolution of the situation created fascinating contradictions, as the new system's success in preventing cultural disasters also eliminated the spontaneous chaos that had made Liu Wei's original performances so compelling to popular audiences. Regional cultural diversity offices found themselves in the paradoxical position of trying to encourage authentic artistic expression through institutional frameworks that inevitably made that expression less authentic. The popular artistic innovation category became dominated by artists who had learned to game the system by producing work that appeared rebellious and spontaneous, but was actually carefully calculated to meet official criteria for acceptable innovation. Second-generation effects included the emergence of professional cultural mediators who specialized in helping amateur artists navigate the complex bureaucracy of the new system, creating a new class of cultural entrepreneurs who made their living by teaching people how to be authentically expressive within officially approved parameters. This led to the development of authenticity schools, where aspiring poets could learn techniques for appearing spontaneous and genuine, while actually following carefully developed formulas for acceptable authentic expression. Perhaps most ironically, the new system's success in containing cultural chaos led to a gradual decline in public interest in poetry as entertainment, as audiences discovered that officially sanctioned authentic expression was often less engaging than the genuinely chaotic disasters that had characterized the Liu Wei era. Regional governors began reporting that attendance at approved cultural events was declining, even as the quality and appropriateness of the performances improved, suggesting that part of the original appeal of alternative poetry had been its unpredictability and potential for spectacular failure rather than its artistic merit or authentic expression. The reformed cultural landscape created opportunities for entirely new types of cultural figures who operated in the spaces between traditional artistic authority and popular expression, representing a generation of cultural entrepreneurs who understood how to work within and around the new system's complex regulations and opportunities. These new players differed significantly from both the traditional court poets, who had dominated the old system, and the amateur authentic expression advocates who had emerged during the Lai era. The most important new figure was Zhou Wenshan, who became the first director of cultural integration for the Imperial Cultural Coordination Office and essentially invented the profession of cultural bureaucrat artist. Zhou's background was perfect for this role. He had classical training in traditional poetry, but also extensive experience with regional cultural traditions from his previous work as a traveling merchant. His contribution was developing practical methods for evaluating and categorizing different types of artistic expression that could maintain quality standards while accommodating diverse cultural traditions and popular innovations. Zhou's specific innovations included creating standardized evaluation criteria for cultural authenticity that could be applied consistently across different regions and artistic traditions, establishing training programs for cultural diversity, officers that taught both artistic appreciation and diplomatic protocol, and developing what became known as the Zhou method for incorporating popular cultural elements into official ceremonies without risking international embarrassment. His work essentially professionalized the management of cultural diversity, creating a new category of government service that combined artistic judgment with administrative competence. Equally significant was Master Li Zufeng, a traditional court poet who successfully reinvented himself as a bridge between classical and popular artistic traditions. Li represented a new type of cultural leader who could maintain credibility with traditional artistic authorities while also connecting with popular cultural movements. His role was crucial because he provided legitimacy for the new system among traditionalists who might otherwise have seen cultural reforms as abandonment of artistic standards. Li's contribution involved developing what he called elevated popular poetry, artistic work that incorporated authentic life experiences and accessible language, while maintaining sophisticated technical standards and classical cultural references. His masterpiece, Songs of the Capital Markets, was a collection of poems about urban commercial life that used traditional forms to explore contemporary social themes, proving that authentic expression and artistic excellence could be combined without sacrificing either authenticity or quality. The third crucial new player was Lady Chen Wuya, who became the first professional cultural diplomat responsible for managing international cultural exchange within the new system. Chen's background included both court cultural training and extensive travel experience that gave her unique insight into how different cultures understood artistic expression and diplomatic protocol. Her specific role involved developing cultural exchange programs that could showcase Tang artistic diversity while maintaining the diplomatic sensitivity required for international relations. Chen's innovations included creating cultural familiarization protocols that prepared foreign diplomats for Tang cultural diversity without overwhelming them with potentially confusing artistic traditions, establishing international artist exchange programs that allowed Tang poets to learn about foreign cultural traditions while sharing their own, and developing diplomatic cultural safety guidelines that essentially codified the lessons learned from Liu Wei's various international disasters. How these new players differed from earlier cultural figures was their understanding that cultural authority in the reformed system required both artistic competence and institutional navigation skills. Unlike traditional court poets who had relied primarily on classical education and social connections, or amateur authentic expression advocates who had relied primarily on popular appeal and personal charisma, the new generation of cultural leaders needed to understand artistic traditions, bureaucratic procedures, diplomatic requirements, and popular cultural trends simultaneously. Their contributions to the cultural landscape included creating sustainable institutional frameworks for cultural diversity that could accommodate change and innovation without losing stability or international credibility. Most importantly, they proved that cultural reform could enhance rather than undermine artistic excellence, provided it was managed by people who understood both the value of tradition and the necessity of adaptation. But some fundamental problems persisted despite the comprehensive reforms and the emergence of skilled new cultural leaders, revealing that certain challenges in managing artistic expression and cultural authority were more deeply rooted in human nature and social dynamics than in specific institutional arrangements. The reform system had successfully prevented diplomatic disasters and cultural chaos, but it had also created new forms of cultural inequality and institutional complexity that generated their own ongoing tensions and contradictions. Continuing, challenges included the persistent difficulty of maintaining authentic popular expression within institutional frameworks that inevitably influenced and constrained that expression. Regional cultural diversity offices found themselves constantly struggling with the paradox that official recognition and support for authentic cultural traditions often changed those traditions in ways that made them less authentic. Popular Poets who had gained access to training and official performance opportunities discovered that institutional involvement affected their artistic voice and audience relationships in unexpected ways. What didn't get resolved was the fundamental tension between artistic excellence and inclusive participation that had originally created the conditions for Liu Wei's disruptive influence. The new system had created separate categories for different types of cultural expression, but it hadn't eliminated the underlying question of whether standards that excluded most people from meaningful cultural participation were ultimately more valuable than inclusive approaches that might lower average quality. This tension continued to generate ongoing debates about cultural policy and artistic education throughout the Tang Dynasty. New versions of old problems emerged as the reformed system created opportunities for different types of cultural manipulation and exploitation. Instead of traditional gatekeeping that excluded authentic expression, the new system created authenticity gatekeeping, where officials had to distinguish between genuine popular cultural traditions and calculated attempts to exploit the system's inclusivity. This led to bureaucratic processes for evaluating cultural authenticity that were often as arbitrary and exclusionary as the traditional systems they had replaced. The most persistent cyclical pattern involved the tendency for any successful cultural innovation to become institutionalized in ways that reduced its original effectiveness. Popular artistic movements that gained official recognition usually lost the spontaneity and rebellious energy that had made them appealing in the first place. Traditional artistic forms that adapted to include popular elements often became so formulaic that they lost their original classical sophistication. The new system was constantly creating and then solving problems that emerged from its own previous solutions. Why certain issues proved intractable became clear as administrators gained experience with the reformed cultural system. Cultural authenticity, artistic quality, popular appeal, and diplomatic appropriateness were often mutually incompatible, goals that required constant balancing and compromise rather than permanent solutions. The skills required to create authentic artistic expression were fundamentally different from the skills required to navigate institutional systems, meaning that many of the most gifted artists were least equipped to benefit from official support and recognition. Perhaps most fundamentally, the reformed system couldn't resolve the basic human tendency for cultural movements to become less interesting and innovative as they became more successful and institutionalized. The energy and creativity that had made Liu Wei's original disasters so memorable and influential had emerged from his complete ignorance of cultural rules and expectations. Once those rules and expectations had been reformed to accommodate authentic expression, it became much more difficult for genuine cultural innovation to emerge, because everyone understood what was officially acceptable and encouraged. The ongoing institutional challenges included managing the increasing complexity of cultural bureaucracy that required more administrative resources and specialized expertise than anyone had anticipated. The new system's success had created demand for cultural programs and services that strained imperial budgets and required ongoing policy development to address emerging situations and opportunities. Regional governors complained that cultural diversity management was consuming resources they needed for basic administrative functions, while cultural program participants complained that bureaucratic requirements were interfering with authentic artistic expression. Most persistently, the reformed system had to constantly address the fact that cultural trends and popular interests were continuously evolving in ways that outpaced institutional adaptation, meaning that policies designed to accommodate current cultural movements were often outdated by the time they were fully implemented. Compared to earlier periods in Tang Dynasty history, when cultural policy had been relatively stable and unchanging, the post-Liu Wei era represented a fundamental shift toward recognizing cultural management as an ongoing governmental responsibility that required constant adaptation and innovation, rather than simple preservation of traditional standards. The reform system was more complex, more expensive, and more administratively demanding than anything the empire had previously attempted. But it was also more responsive to social change and more effective at preventing the kind of cultural crises that could undermine imperial authority and international relationships. What was unique about the Tang Dynasty's approach to cultural reform was the speed and comprehensiveness of the institutional changes they implemented in response to what had begun as relatively minor cultural disturbances. Most historical examples of cultural policy reform involved gradual adaptation over decades or centuries, but the Tang response to the Liu Wei crisis represented one of the first documented cases of a major imperial government completely restructuring its cultural institutions within a few years in response to popular cultural movements. What was universal about the Tang experience was the fundamental tension between maintaining cultural standards and accommodating cultural change that appears in every society dealing with artistic innovation and popular expression. The specific forms that this tension took in Tang Dynasty China was shaped by their particular political system and cultural traditions, but the underlying dynamics of how institutional authority responds to cultural challenge have appeared repeatedly throughout history in different contexts. Lessons that could be learned from the Tang cultural reforms included the importance of developing institutional flexibility that could accommodate change without losing essential functions, the value of creating multiple pathways for cultural participation rather than single gatekeeping systems, and the necessity of involving people who understood both traditional culture and popular movements in designing cultural policy. The Tang experience also demonstrated that cultural crises often provided opportunities for positive institutional development if they were addressed through comprehensive reform rather than simple suppression. Patterns that repeated elsewhere in the historical record included the tendency for cultural gatekeeping systems to become increasingly rigid and disconnected from popular culture until they were challenged by movements that appeared to threaten cultural standards but actually represented legitimate demands for broader cultural participation. The Tang Dynasty's solution of creating parallel systems for different types of cultural expression became a model that influenced cultural policy development in other regions and time periods. Perhaps most importantly, the Tang cultural reforms demonstrated that institutional authority could be strengthened rather than weakened by acknowledging and accommodating cultural diversity and popular artistic expression, provided that accommodation was managed through thoughtful policy development, rather than simply abandoning all cultural standards. This lesson would prove particularly relevant for understanding how complex societies could maintain cultural coherence while adapting to social change and innovation. The comparative analysis also revealed that the Tang Dynasty's success in managing cultural reform was partly due to their extensive bureaucratic capacity and administrative resources that allowed them to implement complex new cultural programs, suggesting that cultural inclusivity might require significant institutional investment that not all governments could afford or sustain. By the mid-850s, nearly a decade after Liu Wei's birthday banquet disaster had triggered the most comprehensive cultural reforms in Tang Dynasty history, subtle signs began pointing to a fundamental shift in how both the government and the public understood the relationship between authentic expression and artistic competence. The warning signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them, but most of the key players were so invested in maintaining the reformed cultural system that they missed the growing evidence that popular interest in authentic poetry was declining as audiences became more sophisticated and discriminating about what made artistic expression both genuine and actually worth experiencing. What key players could see versus what they missed revealed the classic problem of institutional leaders becoming so focused on managing their systems that they lose track of whether those systems are still serving their original purposes. Regional cultural diversity officers were reporting successful implementation of authenticity evaluation programs and steady participation in approved cultural events. But they were missing the fact that audience engagement was becoming increasingly perfunctory and polite rather than enthusiastic and genuine. Cultural bureaucrats were celebrating their success in preventing diplomatic incidents and maintaining artistic standards, but they weren't noticing that spontaneous cultural innovation had essentially disappeared from official cultural life. The resistance to inevitable change came primarily from the cultural bureaucracy that had developed around managing the reform system, including hundreds of officials whose careers and institutional authority depended on maintaining the complex apparatus of cultural diversity management that had emerged from the Liu Wei crisis. These administrators had become experts at evaluating authentic expression, managing cultural diplomacy, and balancing traditional standards with popular inclusion, and they were naturally reluctant to acknowledge that their expertise might be becoming less relevant as cultural trends evolved. More subtly, resistance also came from poets and artists who had built successful careers within the reform system and were invested in maintaining the institutional frameworks that had provided them with opportunities for training, recognition, and official support. The popular artistic innovation category had created a new class of semi-professional poets who understood how to produce work that appeared authentic and rebellious while actually conforming to official guidelines for acceptable cultural expression. The most significant warning sign was the emergence of what cultural observers called post-authentic poetry, artistic work created by a new generation of poets who had grown up within the reformed cultural system and were beginning to rebel against the institutionalized authenticity that had become the new orthodoxy. These younger artists were producing work that was technically sophisticated, genuinely innovative, and completely uninterested in either traditional classical forms or Liu Wei-style authentic expression. The post-authentic movement represented everything that the reformed cultural system hadn't anticipated. Artists who were educated enough to appreciate classical poetry traditions, but creative enough to develop genuinely new forms of expression, and who were authentic enough to ignore both traditional gatekeeping and authenticity requirements in favor of simply creating art that was interesting and meaningful to contemporary audiences. Their work suggested that the cultural synthesis that the reform system had been trying to achieve through institutional management was actually happening organically among artists who had learned from both traditional and popular traditions, without being constrained by it either. Most telling was the fact that post-authentic poetry was gaining audience, attention, and critical respect without requiring any institutional support or official recognition, suggesting that the cultural appetite for innovation and quality had found ways to satisfy itself outside the elaborate bureaucratic frameworks that had been created to manage artistic expression and cultural diversity. The era of Liu Wei's cultural influence didn't end with any dramatic final performance or official declaration that the authentic poetry movement had run its course. Instead, it faded gradually and almost anticlimactically as audiences, artists, and even cultural administrators quietly lost interest in the kinds of agricultural metaphors and deliberately amateur performances that had once seemed so revolutionary and compelling. The specific events that marked the symbolic end of Liu Wei's impact occurred during the Spring Poetry Festival of 856, when Liu Wei himself, now approaching 50 and still completely oblivious to the cultural revolution he had accidentally started, attempted to perform what he announced as his grand retrospective of rural wisdom for the new generation. The performance was vintage Liu Wei, complete with vegetable props, animal sound effects, and detailed explanations of farming techniques delivered through traditional poetry rhythms. But the audience reaction was completely different from anything he had experienced during his years of fame. Instead of the enthusiastic embrace or horrified fascination that had characterized earlier responses to his work, the crowd sat through his performance with polite but obviously forced attention, applauding dutifully at appropriate moments, but clearly more interested in the other poets scheduled to perform later in the program. What made this moment particularly poignant was that Liu Wei's performance was actually better than many of his earlier efforts. He had inadvertently learned something about poetry structure and audience engagement during his years of fame, and his material about rural life remained genuinely authentic and often quite moving. But authentic rural poetry was no longer shocking or innovative, because the cultural landscape had adapted to accommodate exactly that kind of expression. And Liu Wei's particular approach no longer stood out in a world where dozens of other poets were producing similar work with better technical skills and more sophisticated understanding of both agricultural life and artistic expression. The final major players in Liu Wei's story included several of the cultural bureaucrats who had built their careers around managing the authentic expression movement, and who found themselves in the awkward position of watching their institutional relevance decline as the cultural crisis they had been hired to manage gradually resolved itself. Master Zhou Wenshan, the director of cultural integration, spent his final years developing increasingly complex theoretical frameworks for understanding cultural authenticity that fewer and fewer people seemed interested in applying to actual artistic expression. Lady Chen Wuya, the cultural diplomat, successfully transitioned her expertise toward managing international cultural exchange programs that had nothing to do with preventing agricultural poetry disasters and everything to do with promoting Tang artistic excellence and cultural sophistication through traditional diplomatic channels. Her career trajectory illustrated how the skills developed during the cultural crisis period could be adapted to more conventional cultural management challenges. The last attempts to preserve or revive Liu Wei's influence came from academic poets, who began studying his work as an important historical example of how popular cultural movements could challenge institutional authority and create space for artistic innovation. These scholarly treatments of Liu Wei's poetry were more sophisticated and analytically rigorous than anything that had been written about his work during his period of active influence. But they also definitively transformed him from a living cultural force into a historical curiosity worthy of academic study, but no longer relevant to contemporary artistic development. The gradual decline, rather than dramatic final moments, reflected the natural life cycle of cultural movements that emerge from specific historical circumstances and lose relevance as those circumstances change. Liu Wei's authentic rural poetry had been compelling partly because it contrasted so sharply with the exclusive urban sophistication that had dominated Tang cultural life. But once the cultural system had adapted to include rural perspectives and authentic expression, that contrast was no longer available to generate audience interest and artistic innovation. The symbolic endpoints were everywhere and nowhere. The last documented performance of Liu Wei-inspired agricultural poetry at an official cultural event, the final graduation ceremony for the popular artistic innovation training programs that had been created to manage authentic expression. The quiet administrative decision to consolidate the regional cultural diversity offices with other governmental functions that no longer required specialized cultural expertise. The era ended not with dramatic collapse, but with gradual absorption into the mainstream cultural landscape that had been fundamentally changed by the experience of accommodating and managing authentic popular expression. The analysis of causes for the end of Liu Wei's cultural influence revealed that the success of the institutional responses to his Original disruption had ultimately eliminated the conditions that made his approach to poetry revolutionary and compelling. The reformed cultural system had been so effective at accommodating authentic expression and preventing cultural chaos that it had essentially solved the problems that had made Liu Wei's terrible poetry seem important and necessary in the first place. Internal problems with the authentic poetry movement included the fundamental contradiction that institutional support for authentic expression inevitably made that expression less authentic, and the fact that most of Liu Wei's imitators lacked both his genuine rural background and his complete ignorance of cultural expectations that had made his original performances so memorably inappropriate. As the movement became more organized and self-conscious, it lost the spontaneous energy and accidental innovation that had made it culturally significant. External pressures came from the emergence of new forms of artistic expression that incorporated the lessons of both traditional poetry and the authentic expression movement while transcending the limitations of both approaches. The post-authentic poets were producing work that was simultaneously more sophisticated than traditional court poetry and more genuine than institutionally approved authentic expression, creating competition that the original Liu Wei approach couldn't match. The role of individuals versus historical forces in ending the movement showed how cultural change often outpaces the movements that initially drive it. Liu Wei as an individual had never had the artistic vision or cultural understanding to sustain a long-term artistic movement. His influence had been entirely accidental and dependent on specific historical circumstances that were no longer relevant once those circumstances changed. Meanwhile, the historical forces that had created demand for authentic cultural expression had been satisfied through institutional reform and the emergence of new artistic traditions that met popular needs more effectively than agricultural poetry. What could have been done differently was a question that cultural historians would debate for generations. But the most plausible alternative scenarios involved either more gradual institutional adaptation that might have preserved space for ongoing cultural innovation, or more complete rejection of authentic expression that might have maintained traditional standards while ignoring popular cultural needs. Neither alternative seemed likely to have produced better long-term outcomes than the comprehensive reform approach that the Tang Dynasty actually implemented. The inevitability versus contingency question revealed that while Liu Wei's specific influence was highly contingent on his particular combination of incompetence and authenticity, the broader cultural pressures that made his influence possible were probably inevitable. Given the social and economic changes that were affecting Tang Dynasty society, some form of challenge to exclusive cultural gatekeeping was likely to emerge eventually, though it might have taken very different forms if Liu Wei hadn't accidentally become the catalyst for change. Perhaps most significantly, the end of Liu Wei's influence occurred not because institutional authority successfully suppressed popular cultural expression, but because the cultural system had evolved to the point where authentic expression and artistic excellence could coexist without requiring the kind of dramatic opposition that had originally made Liu Wei's terrible poetry seem culturally important. The reform system's success in creating space for diverse forms of cultural participation had eliminated the need for spectacular cultural rebellion, allowing artistic innovation to occur through normal creative development rather than through deliberate violation of cultural norms. The ultimate irony was that Liu Wei's greatest contribution to Tang Dynasty culture was accidentally creating the conditions for a more inclusive and flexible cultural system that no longer needed Liu Wei-style authentic expression to maintain its vitality and relevance. His influence ended because it had succeeded in changing the cultural landscape in ways that made his particular approach to artistic expression obsolete. The immediate aftermath of the end of Liu Wei's active cultural influence was characterized by a period of remarkable stability and creativity that demonstrated how successful the institutional reforms had been in creating sustainable frameworks for cultural diversity and artistic innovation. Who stepped into the vacuum left by the decline of agricultural poetry were not individual replacement figures, but rather a generation of artists and cultural institutions that had learned to balance authentic expression with artistic excellence, without requiring dramatic opposition to traditional authority. The short-term consequences included the gradual normalization of cultural diversity that had once seemed revolutionary and threatening to imperial authority. Regional cultural diversity offices evolved into permanent features of Tang governmental administration, providing ongoing support for local artistic traditions and serving as intermediaries between popular cultural movements and imperial policy requirements. The popular artistic innovation category became a standard pathway for emerging artists to develop their skills and gain recognition without having to choose between authentic expression and institutional approval. Contemporary reactions to the end of Liu Wei's influence were surprisingly mild and positive, reflecting how thoroughly the cultural crisis period had been resolved through institutional adaptation rather than suppression. Traditional poets, who had initially viewed the authentic expression movement as a threat to cultural standards, began acknowledging that the challenge had ultimately strengthened, rather than weakened Tang artistic traditions by forcing them to become more responsive to social change and popular interests. Popular audiences, who had originally embraced Liu Wei's poetry as a refreshing alternative to elite cultural expression, gradually transferred their attention to newer forms of artistic innovation that combined accessibility with higher quality and more sophisticated cultural understanding. The fact that this transition occurred without significant social disruption demonstrated how successfully the reformed cultural system had managed to satisfy popular demand for authentic artistic expression while maintaining artistic standards and diplomatic appropriateness. The attempts at revival or continuation of Liu Wei's specific approach to agricultural poetry were generally unsuccessful because they lacked the historical context and accidental authenticity that had made his original work culturally significant. Academic study of his poetry increased his historical reputation, while simultaneously confirming that his artistic influence belonged to a specific period that had passed, and that future cultural innovation would need to take different forms, appropriate to evolving social and artistic conditions. Most importantly, the immediate legacy included a permanent expansion of what types of artistic expression could be considered legitimate and valuable within Tang cultural life, creating lasting changes in how the empire understood the relationship between cultural authority and popular participation that would influence Chinese artistic development for centuries to come. The legacy of Liu Wei's accidental cultural revolution shaped Chinese artistic and governmental policy development in ways that extended far beyond poetry, establishing precedents for how imperial institutions could adapt to popular cultural movements without abandoning institutional authority or sacrificing diplomatic credibility. The specific influences of his era included the permanent integration of cultural diversity management into governmental administration, the establishment of multiple pathways for artistic recognition and development, and the creation of institutional frameworks that could accommodate cultural innovation while maintaining quality standards and social stability. How later generations viewed Liu Wei's contribution evolved significantly over time, reflecting changing perspectives on the relationship between authentic expression and artistic excellence. Immediately following his period of active influence, Liu Wei was primarily remembered as a cautionary tale about the importance of cultural education and the dangers of allowing unqualified performers access to important ceremonial events. Academic treatments from the late Tang period focused on his role as an accidental catalyst for necessary institutional reforms, emphasizing how his incompetence had exposed problems with cultural gatekeeping that needed to be addressed through policy development rather than individual criticism. By the Tang Dynasty, historians had begun treating Liu Wei as a more complex figure whose genuine authenticity and inadvertent cultural insights had revealed important truths about the relationship between artistic tradition and popular expression that sophisticated observers had missed. Song period cultural theorists developed elaborate analyses of how Liu Wei's terrible poetry had accidentally achieved artistic effects that technically accomplished poets had failed to create through deliberate effort, suggesting that authenticity and spontaneity could sometimes produce more meaningful artistic communication than technical skill and cultural sophistication. The myths versus realities that developed around Liu Wei's story showed how historical figures can become symbolic representations of cultural tensions that extend far beyond their actual individual contributions. The reality was that Liu Wei had been a genuinely incompetent poet whose fame resulted from accidentally violating cultural norms at exactly the right historical moment to trigger necessary institutional reforms. The myth that developed portrayed him as either a deliberate cultural revolutionary who had consciously challenged imperial authority through strategic use of authentic expression, or as a wise fool whose apparent simplicity had concealed profound insights about artistic truth and governmental legitimacy. Why Liu Wei remained important in later historical periods was not because of the quality of his poetry, which continued to be objectively terrible by any reasonable artistic standard, but because his story illustrated fundamental questions about cultural authority, authentic expression, and institutional adaptation that remained relevant as Chinese society continued to evolve and encounter new forms of cultural challenge and innovation. The most significant long-term influence was the establishment of the principle that governmental cultural policy should accommodate rather than simply regulate popular artistic expression, and that institutional authority could be strengthened rather than weakened by acknowledging and incorporating diverse forms of cultural participation. This principle would prove crucial during later periods of Chinese history, when imperial institutions faced cultural challenges from foreign influences, religious movements, and social changes that required adaptive rather than purely conservative responses. Perhaps most importantly, Liu Wei's legacy included the recognition that cultural innovation often emerges from unexpected sources and takes unpredictable forms that established institutions may initially fail to understand or appreciate. The lesson that competent cultural management requires ongoing attention to popular cultural trends and willingness to adapt institutional frameworks to accommodate legitimate forms of authentic expression became a permanent feature of Chinese governmental thinking about cultural policy. The historical impact also extended to diplomatic and international relations, where the Tang Dynasty's successful management of the Liu Wei crisis became a model for how sophisticated governments could handle cultural diversity and popular expression in ways that enhanced rather than undermined their international reputation. Foreign observers noted that the Tang approach to cultural reform demonstrated administrative flexibility and cultural confidence that distinguished them from other imperial systems that relied primarily on cultural suppression to maintain authority. Today, we can see echoes of Liu Wei's accidental cultural disruption in countless contemporary examples of how social media and digital platforms allow authentic voices to bypass traditional gatekeeping systems, often with results that are simultaneously democratizing and chaotic in ways that established cultural institutions struggle to understand or manage effectively. The specific parallels between Liu Wei's agricultural poetry disasters and modern viral content creation are striking in their similarity. Unknown individuals achieving massive influence through content that violates established standards while connecting with audiences who are hungry for authentic expression that mainstream cultural production has failed to provide. The most obvious modern parallel is the phenomenon of viral social media personalities who gain enormous followings not because of professional competence or institutional approval, but because their authentic incompetence or genuine personality. Quirks resonate with audiences who are tired of polished, professionally produced content that feels artificial and disconnected from real human experience. Just like Liu Wei's terrible poetry attracted audiences who were excluded from traditional court culture, modern authentic content creators often appeal to people who feel unrepresented by mainstream media and entertainment industries. Specific parallels include the way that both Liu Wei and modern viral creators often achieve fame through spectacular failures that become more memorable and shareable than technically accomplished but boring professional content. Liu Wei's turnip-waving, diplomatic disasters have direct equivalents in contemporary examples of amateur content creators, whose awkward authenticity generates more engagement than sophisticated professional productions that follow established formulas and industry standards. The pattern of institutional response also shows remarkable similarities between the Tang Dynasty's cultural crisis and modern debates about content moderation, platform governance, and the balance between authentic expression and quality control. Just as the Poetry Bureau struggled to develop policies that could accommodate Liu Wei's influence without abandoning all cultural standards, modern social media platforms and cultural institutions are constantly trying to balance authentic user expression with content quality, community safety, and advertiser friendliness. What hasn't changed about human nature is the fundamental tension between institutional authority and authentic individual expression that makes both Liu Wei's story and contemporary cultural conflicts so persistent and difficult to resolve through simple policy solutions. People continue to crave genuine human connection and authentic artistic expression, but they also value quality, competence, and social stability in ways that create ongoing conflicts between inclusivity and standards. Similar patterns in different contexts include the way that both historical and contemporary cultural gatekeeping systems become rigid and disconnected from popular interests until they are challenged by movements that initially appear threatening to established authority, but actually represent legitimate demands for broader cultural participation. The specific forms that these challenges take vary dramatically across different time periods and technological contexts, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably consistent. Modern examples of Liu Wei-style authentic disruption include everything from viral TikTok creators who gain massive followings through genuine personality quirks and amateur content creation, to podcast hosts whose conversational authenticity attracts larger audiences than professional broadcasters, to indie artists whose deliberately amateurish approaches to music production connect with listeners who are tired of overproduced mainstream content. The lessons for contemporary issues include the importance of developing institutional frameworks that can accommodate authentic expression without abandoning all quality standards, the value of creating multiple pathways for cultural participation, rather than single gatekeeping systems, and the necessity of recognizing that cultural innovation often emerges from unexpected sources that established institutions may initially fail to appreciate. Perhaps most importantly, Liu Wei's story demonstrates how attempts to control authentic cultural movements through suppression or rigid regulation often backfire by driving innovation underground or creating opposition that becomes more disruptive than the original challenge would have been if handled with greater flexibility and understanding. The contemporary relevance also extends to questions about how democratic societies should balance free expression with social responsibility, how cultural institutions should adapt to technological changes that democratize content creation, and how governments and platforms should respond to authentic popular movements that challenge established cultural and political authority, while sometimes producing content that is genuinely problematic or harmful. Modern technology has accelerated and amplified the dynamics that Liu Wei accidentally triggered, creating cultural disruptions that spread faster and reach wider audiences than anything possible in ancient China. But the fundamental human needs and institutional challenges remain essentially unchanged from those that characterized the Tang Dynasty's poetry crisis. Even now, over a millennium after Liu Wei's last documented poetry performance, his influence continues to shape academic study, popular culture, political discourse, and social movements in ways that demonstrate how historical examples of authentic cultural disruption remain relevant to contemporary debates about artistic expression, institutional authority, and social change. Academic study of Liu Wei's cultural impact has become a standard case study in courses on Chinese history, cultural policy, and social movement development, with scholars continuing to develop new interpretations of how his accidental challenge the Tang Dynasty cultural authority illustrates broader principles of institutional adaptation and popular resistance. Recent academic work has focused particularly on how the Tang response to Liu Wei's influence provides models for managing cultural diversity and authentic expression in modern multicultural societies. Popular culture references to Liu Wei appear regularly in contemporary Chinese literature, film, and internet culture, where he has become a symbol of authentic expression, triumphing over institutional pretension and a representative figure for anyone who has ever felt excluded from cultural participation by gatekeeping systems they couldn't understand or access. Modern adaptations of his story often emphasize different aspects of his legacy, depending on contemporary cultural and political concerns. Political discourse in modern China continues to reference the Liu Wei precedent when discussing cultural policy, artistic freedom, and the relationship between governmental authority and popular expression. His story provides a historical framework for understanding how political institutions can accommodate cultural diversity and authentic expression without undermining governmental stability or international credibility. Social movements focused on democratizing cultural participation and challenging artistic gatekeeping often invoke Liu Wei as a historical example of how authentic expression can create space for broader cultural inclusion and institutional reform. Contemporary advocates for accessible arts education, inclusive cultural programming, and alternative artistic platforms frequently reference his legacy when arguing for policies that prioritize authentic expression and popular participation over traditional measures of artistic excellence. Why people still care about Liu Wei's story reflects ongoing concerns about authenticity, institutional authority, and cultural participation that remain as relevant today as they were during the Tang Dynasty. His example continues to resonate because it demonstrates how individual authentic expression can accidentally trigger broader social changes that reshape the relationship between institutions and the people they serve. The continuing relevance also extends to contemporary debates about social media influence, viral content creation, and the democratization of cultural production, where Liu Wei's accidental revolution provides historical perspective on how technological and social changes can disrupt established cultural systems in ways that create both opportunities and challenges for authentic expression and institutional stability. The final assessment of Liu Wei's cultural legacy reveals a figure whose historical significance was entirely disproportionate to his individual artistic merit, demonstrating how sometimes the most important cultural changes are triggered by people who have no understanding of their broader historical role or the long-term implications of their actions. His story illustrates the complex relationship between individual agency and historical forces, showing how accidental cultural disruption can produce institutional reforms and social changes that more deliberate efforts might have failed to achieve. Liu Wei's lasting contribution was not his poetry, which remained objectively terrible throughout his career and after, but his inadvertent demonstration that cultural authority depends ultimately on popular confidence and institutional responsiveness, rather than traditional gatekeeping and exclusive standards. His influence proved that authentic expression could coexist with artistic excellence, provided that institutional frameworks were flexible enough to accommodate diverse forms of cultural participation without abandoning all quality standards. The broader historical lesson of his legacy is that cultural innovation often emerges from unexpected sources and takes unpredictable forms that challenge established institutions to adapt rather than simply resist change. His story provides a model for understanding how democratic societies can manage cultural diversity and authentic expression while maintaining institutional stability and international credibility. Perhaps most importantly, Liu Wei's legacy demonstrates that the most significant cultural changes often result from the interaction between individual authentic expression and institutional adaptation, rather than from either individual genius or institutional planning alone. His accidental cultural revolution succeeded because it occurred at exactly the right historical moment when Tang Dynasty society was ready for cultural reform, but lacked the catalyst to trigger necessary changes. The ultimate irony of his legacy is that Liu Wei achieved a lasting historical significance precisely because he was so completely unqualified for the cultural role he accidentally assumed, proving that sometimes the most important contributions to cultural development come from people who are too incompetent to understand the rules they're breaking. Looking back across the remarkable decade from 847 to 856 CE that constituted Liu Wei's accidental cultural revolution, we've witnessed one of history's most unlikely success stories: how a spectacularly incompetent turnip farmer's son managed to single-handedly reshape the entire cultural policy of the Tang Dynasty through the simple expedient of being so authentically terrible at poetry that he couldn't be ignored, dismissed, or easily categorized within existing institutional frameworks. The key patterns that emerged from this extraordinary saga reveal timeless truths about cultural authority, authentic expression, and institutional adaptation that remain as relevant today as they were over a millennium ago. The major themes that have defined our journey include the fundamental tension between institutional gatekeeping and popular cultural participation, the unexpected power of authentic expression to challenge established authority, even when that expression is objectively incompetent, and the capacity for flexible institutions to transform potential threats into opportunities for positive development and reform. We've seen how cultural movements can emerge from the most unlikely sources and spread in completely unpredictable ways that create both chaos and innovation simultaneously. Most surprising among our discoveries has been the recognition that Liu Wei's influence was never really about poetry at all, but rather about the deeper human need for authentic cultural expression and meaningful participation in artistic life that had been systematically excluded by centuries of increasingly rigid cultural gatekeeping. His terrible poems about chickens and turnips resonated with audiences not because they were good, but because they were genuinely connected to real human experience in ways that sophisticated court poetry had ceased to be. The most important takeaways from this cultural adventure include the understanding that authentic expression and artistic excellence are not necessarily incompatible goals, but that achieving both simultaneously requires institutional frameworks sophisticated enough to accommodate diverse forms of cultural participation without abandoning all standards. Liu Wei's legacy demonstrates that cultural innovation often emerges from the intersection of individual authenticity and institutional flexibility, rather than from either pure individual genius or pure institutional planning. How our understanding has evolved throughout this journey reflects the complexity of cultural change processes that cannot be reduced to simple narratives about tradition versus innovation or authority versus rebellion. Instead, we've discovered that the most significant cultural developments often result from unexpected combinations of individual accident, social need, institutional response, and historical timing that create opportunities for positive change that more deliberate efforts might have failed to achieve. Perhaps most fundamentally, Liu Wei's story has illustrated how cultural movements are ultimately about human connection and social inclusion, rather than about specific artistic techniques or institutional structures. His influence succeeded because it created space for people who have been excluded from cultural participation to find their own voices and express their own experiences, even when those voices and experiences didn't conform to established standards of sophistication and cultural appropriateness. The broader lesson of this entire cultural episode is that healthy societies require institutional frameworks that can accommodate authentic expression while maintaining quality standards, and that the most effective cultural policies are those that create multiple pathways for artistic participation rather than single gatekeeping systems that inevitably exclude more people than they include. Perhaps the most perfect encapsulation of everything we've discovered about Liu Wei's cultural legacy can be found in a small incident that occurred in 863, 7 years after his final documented performance, when a young court poet named Zhang Qinming was preparing for his first major imperial ceremony and discovered that he was suffering from severe performance anxiety about whether his technically accomplished but personally disconnected poetry would resonate with the audience in any meaningful way. Zhang's background represented everything that the reformed cultural system had been designed to achieve. He had received excellent classical training in traditional poetry forms, but he had also been educated in a new cultural diversity curricula that included study of authentic expression and popular artistic traditions. His poetry was technically sophisticated, culturally appropriate, and genuinely innovative in its synthesis of traditional and contemporary elements, representing the kind of artistic development that the post-Liu Wei institutional reforms had been intended to foster. But as Zhang prepared for his performance, he found himself unexpectedly thinking about Liu Wei's story and wondering whether his own careful adherence to both traditional standards and reformed guidelines had somehow eliminated the authentic human connection that had made Liu Wei's terrible poetry so memorably compelling. The night before his performance, Zhang made a decision that would have been unthinkable during the rigid gatekeeping era, but was perfectly possible within the flexible frameworks that had emerged from the cultural crisis period. Instead of performing his prepared classical piece, Zhang decided to begin his presentation with a brief, genuine reflection on his own nervousness and his hopes for connecting meaningfully with his audience through artistic expression. This wasn't calculated authentic performance or deliberate violation of cultural norms. It was simply a moment of genuine human vulnerability that acknowledged the personal stakes involved in cultural participation and artistic communication. The audience reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Not because Zhang's moment of authenticity was technically impressive or culturally revolutionary, but because it created a genuine human connection that enhanced rather than detracted from the sophisticated poetry that followed. His performance succeeded in achieving exactly what the reformed cultural system had been designed to enable: authentic expression and artistic excellence, working together to create meaningful cultural communication.